Happy Sunday, everyone. Welcome to another Sunday Musing. I am your host, Connor Boyack, and today we're talking about apostasy. We're talking about different and changing versions of apostasy over the decades, in particular what the church handbook of instructions, or the manual, the handbook as we call it, has said about the topic of apostasy and how that has changed over time. I will tease for you right now that it has changed a lot over time. We are going back nearly a century to look at early examples of how apostasy was considered, how it was enforced, what church leaders thought about it, how they handled it. And this is particularly important because, some of the prominent excommunications in the past have been based off of apostasy. I've done past musings talking about, should I be excommunicated for apostasy based off of the current definition in the handbook, which we'll get to at the end. Because the definition is not what one, or at least not what I would expect a church to enforce when we think of kind of the common understanding of the term apostasy. So we'll get into that just a little bit at the end, but first we're going to go back in time. And we're going to start with a comparison clear back in 1940. Now, there are earlier church manuals. I just got to the point where I'm like, okay, we got enough to work with. I don't want to, do a 3-hour musing here. And so the earliest example that I'm going to share with you is with the church handbook clear back in 1940. Now, years ago, all over the internet, particularly in Reddit, there were all kinds of people that were like, oh, let's get the church handbook and let's upload it to this, sketchy site, or let's have the Mormon leaks archive it. And so if you go back and look at Mormon Reddit or ex-Mormon Reddit or all these places where in years past they would talk about the handbook, there's all these dead links to sites that no longer exist years later. And that was being done in part and being fought against by Kurt McConkie and the likes, the church on the church's behalf, because the handbook was not available to the lay membership. This was kind of a privileged document that people like me were not able to access, and let alone compare over time. And this was kept under lock and key. And it was about almost a decade ago when the church flipped the switch and decided to start putting the handbook online. And I guess along with that, the church history library, the online catalog, they started publishing old versions of many church documents, but including the handbook. And so those are the early sources that are now easy to find, where before you'd have kind of people spelunking across the internet trying to find these, PDF downloads or these poorly digitized, photographed old manuals that some guy's uncle's brother's neighbor had because he was a bishop and he died, and we have the handbook, So we're going to start with 1940. It's straight from the horse's mouth. This is from the church's website, official documentation of early handbooks. Now, as I share this, I'm going to have a comparison on the left and on the right, showing you the previous version of the handbook and then the next iteration, and then we can do some comparison. For the benefit of those of you listening just to the audio, I, of course, will read through all of this, but this is the comparison is a visual one just to see the textual changes that have been made. We're going to start with 1940. Of course, since we're not comparing a prior one, we're just going to have one column of data here. And I will read from the 1940 Church Manual under the section called Transgressions. There is a portion that says, transgressions which ordinarily justify consideration by the bishop's court, that's what they called it at the time, are, and then they have a list of things which includes apostasy, and opposition to the church or deliberate disobedience to its regulations. Okay, that's what they called policies back then. They then have, and this is interesting, they have a whole section on polygamy. Now, this is on the tail of, decades prior. They had the manifesto, then they had the second manifesto where they're like, no, we really mean it. We're not going to live polygamy. And they're cracking down. There's still apostles who are secretly practicing polygamy. You got Joseph F's son, you got all this drama. So in the 1940 manual, they have this whole section connected to apostasy, which is why I mention it here. And they say the following: a legal practice of polygamous or plural marriage. That's the heading. As persistent reports are coming to us of activity by a group said to be propagating a false doctrine and illegal practice of polygamous or plural marriage, the group apparently being composed of avowed or virtual apostates, of persons excommunicated from the church, and of a few misguided members, We deem it wise again to declare that neither the group nor its activities are in any way connected with the church, that not only are the activities unauthorized and therefore illegal and void, but that they are contrary to the rule of the church and the will of the Lord as revealed through President Woodruff, this is referencing the 1890 Manifesto, and adopted by the church, and that marriages performed by members of this group are false and mock marriages. It is almost unnecessary to add that the activities of this group are violative of the laws of the land, and that certain of the group members seem subject to criminal prosecution. We desire that this matter shall be fully and directly called to the attention of every Latter-day Saint, that none shall be in ignorance of the falsity of the doctrines or of the illegality of the practices of this group, nor in doubt as to the spiritual falling away of its members and those who follow them, nor unaware of the church disciplinary measures which must be taken against unrepentant participants in this unrighteous and rebellious activity. So here we're getting to excommunication of all these people, which were there actively doing. Any church member belonging to this group or adopting or advocating its doctrines and practices is not to be considered in good fellowship in the church, is not entitled to, and should not be granted any of the rights and privileges appertaining to church members, such as entry into the temples, the payment of tithes, participation in the activities of the priesthood quorums or of the auxiliary organizations of the church, or in other ward, stake, or church activities, and should, unless they truly repent, be immediately and formally dealt with by excommunication, as directed in the official statement. The great law-abiding, faithful church membership cannot and must not be brought into disrepute, nor their honor and good faith challenged by a small group of recalcitrant and evilly led church members in rebellion. Each president of stake and each bishop will proceed immediately to correct any situation of the kind described and existing within his jurisdiction. There must be no condoning of or trifling with this rebellious condition, which must be brought to an end at once. This is imperative. Wow. Okay, that's a lot to say. It's all about polygamy. They're clearly dealing with it. They're trying to purge from their ranks. This all gets dropped, by the way, as you'll see from the next iteration of the handbook. But this is like the focus of apostasy, is connection to people who persist in practicing polygamy when the church formally abandoned it. There's one final brief section in this handbook pertaining to the issue, in a section called Baptizing Children of Excommunicated Persons. Now, this is interesting because that's the headline, excommunicated persons, not polygamists, not apostate polygamists, not people, nothing. It's about broadly excommunicated persons. And yet, here is what it says in the paragraph. We advise that the children of men and women who have been excommunicated from the church because of their having entered into illicit relations under the guise of plural marriage. So now here we're saying not like the thing that's important here is basically the only connection to apostasy is persisting in practicing polygamy. That's like all they're contemplating with this section, because the title again is how do we handle the baptism of someone who's been excommunicated? But then they go on to say plural marriage, as if like that's the only notion of apostasy in this era of the church, is people who are engaged this way. I think it's very interesting. They're saying that these children be not baptized until they have sufficient understanding to apply intelligently for baptism and can give assurance that they accept the teaching and doctrines of the church and express regret for the opposition manifested by their parents to the rules of the church. There is no consistency in baptizing a child and having him re-enter a home, the spirit of which is antagonistic to the authorities of the church and out of harmony with its principles. So it's fascinating where that paragraph constrains it to polygamy and the persistence thereof rather than apostasy for other reasons. It's like the church had not yet matured sufficiently to the point where there would be, again, I mean, like that's wrong because in Joseph's day, there was, a century prior, there was plenty of apostasy for all kinds of theological issues. But it's kind of interesting how the handbook constrains that. Okay, so that is 1940. Now, as I scroll down, you're going to see that 1940 handbook entry still on the left. And the example that we're going to get to on the right is from 1960, where there is a heavy rewrite of the text. And so in later versions, you're going to see specific amendments in bold and underline, which are additions, or strike through text, which is removals. But in this case, I'm just including the full text because it is a very heavy rewrite. This is 1960. So the next version of the church manual comes 2 decades later. And it says, transgressions, under the headline, some sins will require bishops' court action and possibly trial by the stake presidency and high council. Others may be handled without taking them to trial, provided there is sincere repentance. Transgressions referred to here include ... a list of things like sex, sins and so forth, and apostasy. Interestingly, they spell it, this is the only handbook in which they spell it with a C, apostasy, C-Y. In all others, it's correctly spelled apostasy with an S. As well as open opposition to the rules and regulations of the church. So you'll note that prior in 1940, it said regulations. Here it's saying rules and regulations. Then they continue much more briefly than in 1940. In 1960, it simply says that the illegal practice of so-called polygamous or plural marriage is still being taught and entered into by some who are apostate in their views. Such persons should be sought out and tried for their membership in the church, in other words, excommunicated. Persons who are attracted by apostate teachings should be labored with, but if they do not repent and still advocate or accept these wrongful teachings, they should be tried for their membership and, if found guilty, excommunicated. So attracted by apostate teachings, that's again a general term, could refer to any apostasy, but in light of the prior paragraph, in light of the culture of the time, it's kind of very clear that this is still, wrapped up in the issue of polygamy. All right, so let's scroll down. That's it for 1960. Now we're going to get into 1976. Again, they have a total rewrite of the handbook, and so we're not going to do the specific amendment comparisons. This is just all new text in the 1976 version where they just start from scratch. And under a heading called Grounds for Church Court Action, they include a list of items, the first of which says open opposition to and deliberate disobedience to the rules and regulations of the church. So they're preserving here the term rules and regulations of the church. They're talking and preserving the language of open opposition. They're adding deliberate disobedience, right? Then in a section called Not Grounds for Church Court Action, they say that inactivity in the church in and of itself is not sufficient reason to summon a member before a church court for excommunication or disfellowshipment. So 1976 is the first time. So often, right, the early revelations from Joseph, the later handbook amendments from kind of the corporate church are all in response to things that are happening, questions that arise. What do we do? Hey, I had this bishop in this random ward that kicked someone out of the church because they hadn't been to church in 2 years. Is that the right thing? And then these questions kind of bubble up. Leaders are grappling with it. We get these updates in the handbook. So clearly this had been happening and people are wrestling with how do we do it? The church says, no, simply being inactive is not a reason to be kicked out of the church through excommunication. The handbook continues to say, joining another church is not in itself grounds for excommunication or disfellowshipment. A member who joins another church should be labored with and encouraged to return to the church. If court action is necessary, regular church court procedures for excommunication should be followed. An individual that joins an apostate group should be brought to the attention of the first presidency. So again, there's kind of this slight inference. Who else out there is an apostate group other than a polygamous sect? Do I join the FLDS church versus the LDS church and so forth? So they're still kind of wrestling with these issues, although clearly the language about joining another church can pertain not just to LDS sects or splinter groups, but any church. So that's 1976. Then we move next into 1983. Again, we get a total rewrite of the manual, at least this section. I should be clear. They're not necessarily rewriting the whole thing. I'm just looking at this section of apostasy. We get a total rewrite in which we have this new list. Church courts may be convened to consider, and then they have this list of items, the first of which is open opposition to and deliberate violation of the rules and regulations of the church. That's same language as before, including associating with apostate cults or avoiding their doctrines. So here we get the term cult coming in, the apostate cults or advocating their doctrines. So it's not saying church courts shall be convened, right? It's saying they may be convened, but it's clear that open opposition, deliberate violation, affiliating with so-called apostate cults is all grounds for excommunication. The 1983 manual goes on to say, church courts should not be convened merely because a member is totally inactive unless, and so here's some new conditions added to the prior language. Number one, he's influencing others toward apostasy. Or number two, makes a written request, not a form letter, at his own initiative to have his name removed from the records of the church, and patient efforts to dissuade him are unsuccessful. So they would refuse form letters, which are now all in vogue. There's websites that can help you leave the church if you want. Here's the legal form letter to do, and there's just people doing that. But back in the day, they didn't like form letters, and they wouldn't even accept a letter. They would first try to dissuade you of that notion, and only if unsuccessful, would a church court be convened to remove you as a member? Now that's not done at all. It's just a letter to the office of the First Presidency, and bing, bang, boom, you're done. So that's interesting. This question of inactivity. Now they're saying, well, if you're inactive, or if you're not coming to our church and you're trying to pull other people away to your FLDS sect or splinter group or other church denomination, then that's when we have a problem. Believe whatever you want, but if you're trying to influence members toward apostasy, then that is grounds for excommunication. The 1983 manual continues to say that a court should not be convened for a church member who attends another church unless he has joined another church or an apostate cult is involved. However, if a church member joins another church, he should be cited and brought to a church court to be tried for his membership. So attendance alone is not an issue. Joining, official affiliation, is the issue. It continues to say that members who are attracted by apostate teachings, especially those of persons of groups advocating plural marriage, should receive immediate attention. Those who openly oppose the church or persist in teaching false doctrine may be brought before a church court. So we got this more ample definition going on in 1983. And then we lead to 1989, another total rewrite. This is the first version of what has been slightly amended over time, including today. So the 1989 definition of apostasy forms kind of the base foundation of today's version, though it has gone through a number of amendments, as you shall soon see. So 1989, again, a total rewrite. This new version has a list under the heading apostasy, not transgression like it was before, not, church court may be convened. Now there's a definition heading apostasy, and it says that as used here, apostasy refers to members who, number one, repeatedly act in clear, open, and deliberate public opposition to the church or its leaders. So here you'll already note we're moving away from rules and regulations of the church. Now we're talking about the church just in general, just repeated, clear, open, deliberate public opposition to the church. So I guess by inference, that's to the church's rules and the church's regulations. And then we also get the term or its leaders added, okay? And the term repeatedly and the term clear, they're keeping open, they're keeping deliberate, but you can see how some of this morphs and the lawyers are having their way with it. Number two, another definition of apostasy in the 1989 manual is if they persist in teaching as church doctrine information that is not church doctrine after being corrected by their bishops or higher authority. Again, this still has a tinge of polygamy to it. People are claiming, special, whatever, but there's plenty of other stuff out there that people are doing, and this is after correction. If you've been shut down, but you continue, then you're in apostasy. Number three, if they continue to follow the teachings of apostate cults, such as those who advocate plural marriage, after being corrected by their bishops or higher authority. So this is following teachings. This is no longer about, joining the other apostate cult. It's if you're following the teachings. But there is language that continues to say that in such cases, excommunication may be necessary when repentance is not evident after counseling and encouragement. Total inactivity in the church or attending or merely holding membership in another church does not itself constitute apostasy. So that's interesting. Merely holding membership in another church is no longer, so if you formally affiliate. It continues, church leaders must take disciplinary action against those who are in apostasy to protect the membership at large. The Savior taught the Nephites that they should continue to minister to a transgressor, but if he repent not, he shall not be numbered among my people, that he may not destroy my people. So now they add this scriptural basis within the handbook for justification for excommunication of so-called apostates. But you've got this other language in here, right? So total inactivity is another reason, or attending another church or a cult is not a reason, or even holding membership in. So they've walked that back. Before it was if you join, if you formally affiliate, then that's grounds for excommunication. And now that's being walked back slightly in the 1989 manual. Okay, but it has strong language here. Church leaders must take disciplinary action, not necessarily excommunication, but disciplinary action of some kind against those who are in apostasy. And now we have this three-prong version, not three prongs, three separate criteria of who an apostate is. Right, you're working against the church or its leaders repeatedly, clearly, openly, deliberately. If you're persisting in teaching church doctrine that your stake president or bishop has said is not church doctrine, or if you're quote unquote following the teachings of apostate cults. So now you get this broader thing. They're saying it's not grounds if you affiliate with someone else, but if you continue to follow the teachings of a quote unquote apostate cult after being corrected, that is also grounds for excommunication. So that is 1989, giving us the foundation of what is to come. Subsequent edits, as you will see throughout the remainder of this musing, are just amendments thereto. It was fun reading the 1940 and the 1950 manual, kind of this like formal English, you know how books were written back then. You can see it in those statements themselves. And I'm like, I was born in the wrong era. That type of English and that kind of rational, analytical, clear, you know, wordy, verbose stuff, like that's my jam. It was fun to read, and clearly like everyone reads at a, you know, 8th grade level, if that now, and we've all been dumbed down. Anyways, 1989. There was not an update for another 9 years. So we get the 1998 manual, okay? And as you'll see here on the left, we have kind of the previous year's version. And then on the right, we have some amendments. So if there is any strike through text, as there is here, you can see they get rid of the word cults, right? And that becomes one of the changes. So they've stricken through the word cults, and they've added the word sects. So now it's if you continue to follow the teachings of apostate sects, not cults. They're softening the language a little bit. They also say that excommunication may be necessary not when repentance is not evident, but if repentance is not evident. It's clear that that's what they were meaning to say before. They weren't saying when in the case of absolute, like, repentance will never be evident. So that's just kind of a minor change. They change, they take this sentence, total inactivity of the church, they push that down to the bottom, as you'll shortly see. In fact, I'll just scroll up right now and show all of that so you can see that sentence down at the bottom. And then they change, instead of church leaders must take disciplinary action, they change it to priesthood leaders. They remove the words, those who are an apostate, they just now call them apostates. And then they say, instead of protecting the membership at large, they're saying protect church members. These are all kind of minor changes, mostly just getting to the original point with better language, but it's clear that they're trying to soften, the word cult, perhaps in part because the Mormon church is often being accused by others of being wrongly accused of being a cult. And so maybe there's kind of like, hey, maybe we shouldn't, throw stones in a glass house or whatever, right? If people are doing that to us, basic golden rule, let's not do it to them. So they change it to sects. Okay, that is 1989. We then go from 1989 to 1998. That was that update, 1998. Then we go to 2006. And again, we get a few little changes. The kind of overall foundation is still there. You can see numbers 1, 2, 3, no changes. But then they add a number 4 criteria for apostasy. If you formally join another church, so they brought this back. They walked it back before, and now they're bringing it back. The condition of apostasy is if you formally join another church, okay? And then we get this additional modification down below. So they remove the holding membership in because it's clear that they've now strengthened that. Before it said does not constitute apostasy. Now they're saying it does constitute apostasy. And then they say, however, if a member formally joins another church, excommunication or name removal may be necessary if formal membership is not ended after counseling and encouragement. So they kind of gone back and forth on this one. It was in and then it was out and now it's back in. What do we do with people who formally join another church/cult/sect? So now in 2006, they're saying, now this is apostasy, therefore grounds for termination of your membership. So that's 2006. Then we go to 2010. Just 4 years later, we get another update. Again, numbers 1 through 3, all the same. Number 4, which they just added a few years prior, formally join another church. They're now amending to say formally join another church and advocate its teachings. So now if you simply, like let's say I want to marry someone and the government says I have to be a minister, and so I go online, and I'm not saying this is what they're responding to with the handbook, but an example is I can go online and formally affiliate with some like internet-based church of whatever. And so now under the 2010 handbook, now I'm not an apostate simply because I've formally joined another church. I have to also advocate its teachings to be guilty of apostasy. So we're getting like ping pong on this one, depending on like who you affiliate with and to what degree, and are you advocating, or are you just affiliate, are you just attending, are you promoting their teachings, or we kind of go all over the place on this one. Then they delete the paragraph that previously said that in such cases excommunication may be necessary if repentance is not evident after counseling and encouragement. They just purge that paragraph altogether, and then they make a little amendment at the beginning also to add in that it's not just about formally joining another church, it's also you have to and advocate its teachings. And then they make a minor clarification edit down below that we're talking about formal membership in the other church, not in our church. So we're getting kind of the ping pong here on that particular aspect of apostasy. So this was 2010. All right, now let's go to 2015. This got a lot of fanfare from the Salt Lake Tribunes of the world and all the lefties, because the edit that was made here was a new number 4, sandwiched between the previous one, adding that a definition of apostasy is to be in a same-gender marriage. So the handbook was updated to add that as a factor, or as a characteristic of apostasy, is if you are in a same-gender marriage. That was 2015. As you can see, there were no other changes. They just added that in. Then, if we go down to 2019, we get a whole lot of new stuff, which we're going to go through, among which is they removed what they just added 4 years prior. They removed the same-gender marriage thing. But at the very top, you'll see they've added 2 new paragraphs in 2019, in which they say that issues of apostasy often have an impact beyond the boundaries of a ward or stake. They need to be addressed promptly to protect others. The bishop counsels with the stake president if he feels that a member's action may constitute apostasy. The bishop or stake president may place informal membership restrictions on the member. That's a new term that they introduce in this handbook, I believe, is when it was introduced. Before it was, various, it was disfellowshipment and so forth. The stake president promptly counsels with the area presidency. However, only the stake president decides whether a membership council or other action is necessary. Okay, so we got 2 new preface paragraphs before we just outright say what apostasy is, to give guidance to not only bishops and stake presidents, but now also members, because now the handbook is public. This is 2019 and anyone can see this. And so the church, now that this is public, makes a whole lot of edits, as you'll see. So this minor one here, apostasy refers to a member who engaging in any of the following, rather than before they had this list, and perhaps one could argue that you had to satisfy every criteria in that list to be considered apostate. Now they're making abundantly clear that if you engage in any of the following, right, you are guilty. The first one is they remove the word open, repeatedly acting in clear, and then they remove open, and deliberate public opposition to the church. And then they add, and we've talked about this in past musings, its doctrine or its policies. So they had the church and leaders, which they added in, a few decades prior. And then they had, deliberate and open before. So now it's repeatedly acting in clear and deliberate public opposition to the church, its doctrine, its policies, or its leaders. Now, I just showed you, right? I've done musings on like policy versus doctrine, and like, why are we equating? Then I talked about this update to the handbook a few years ago, where it's like, well, wait a minute, you're an apostate if you just disagree with a policy, not even a doctrine, right? And so I pointed at the time, I believe, to this amendment to the musing, to the handbook. What I did not do in that musing is go dig in, as I've now done, to see that policies, or what they called before rules and regulations, were long in the handbook and considered grounds for apostasy and therefore excommunication. So they've added in doctrines and policies to the list. Then for number 2, they say persisting in teaching as church doctrine what is not church doctrine, rather than information after. So that, minor change here. They add a new prong, a new condition for apostasy, which is showing a pattern of intentionally working to weaken the faith and activity of church members. That's entirely new. Then they edit what before was number 3 about continuing to follow the teachings of apostate sects. They now strike out the words such as those who advocate plural marriage. So this has been in there since 1940. And now in what year are we in this one? 2019. So 80 years later in the handbook, they're now finally getting rid of the plural marriage polygamy issue because, it's been abundantly clear for multiple generations that, and now it's frankly not really much of an issue for upstanding members of the church. And then they delete what was number 4, are a same gender in a same gender marriage. So they just added that 4 years prior, and now they're already removing it in 2019, and they leave the final one alone. Then we've got some big changes here. They delete the paragraph about priesthood leaders taking disciplinary action, in part because they kind of rewrote it into that preface paragraph about bishops and stake presidents and what they should do. And they make some minor changes down below. In part, this is when they're getting rid of the word excommunication or name removal. They change it to withdrawing his or her membership. They get rid of the counseling and encouragement thing, right? So now that final sentence just reads, however, if a member formally joins another church and advocates its teachings, withdrawing his or her membership may be necessary, period. So no longer is this like initial counseling and encouragement. Now it's just, hey, you did that, therefore, okay, we're going to withdraw your membership. Much more kind of procedural, perhaps, and due to the growing church and the difficulty of the administrative logistical side of doing this for everyone who is guilty of it. Okay, that is 2019. And then we proceed to today. I believe these changes were made 2024. Couldn't fully confirm that, but this is what, as of 2026, is in the handbook. Pretty sure it was 2024, but it's in the past few years. We get the current version, which again, using the 2019 as the kind of base to compare against, we get some changes. First is in that second paragraph, they get rid of a lot of the new language that they just put in there a few years ago, specifically removing where it says that the bishop or stake president may place informal membership restrictions on the member. The stake president counsels the area presidency. Only the stake president decides. So now, unless it's elsewhere, like it could be elsewhere in the manual, I haven't checked, so don't take my word for it. Like it probably is another point in the manual, but removing the language about saying that only the stake president decides whether a membership council or other action is necessary. There's been a lot of situations that I don't have firsthand information on, but hear a lot of whispers about where area authorities are kind of initiating excommunications and sending information down to the stake presidency and telling them you need to hold a membership council, right? And so removing that language here is what kind of allows for that type of activity to happen from the top, rather than empowering the stake presidency to have the sole determination of whether a membership council or other action is actually necessary. Okay, and then we get our list, and the only thing that really changes is this removal of the final paragraph about inactivity in the church or joining another church. So again, over the decades, there's been this ping pong of what do we do with people who join another church? Are they just attending? Are they advocating its teachings? Are they promoting its doctrine? Are they agreeing with its doctrine? Back and forth, and now in the latest version, that's all purged, and the apostasy definition just says that if you formally join another church and promote its teachings, and they're just leaving that there. Okay, so that is the current definition in the handbook. So what do we do with all that? Whew, there's a lot there. I'm just going to make a few points, and then we'll wrap. Let me first address this line that has kind of evolved, not kind of, it's very much evolved over the decades, but has its precedent clear back in 1940 and likely before. I just chose to cut it off somewhere to move on, which in its current form says repeatedly acting in clear and deliberate public opposition to the church, its doctrine, its policies, or its leaders. By removing the word open, that's interesting, because now they're saying even close, behind the scenes, if you privately communicate with people. So now they're giving themselves, the church, more ability to prosecute individuals who they think are guilty of apostasy, even if they're doing it behind closed doors, in people's living rooms, on a phone call, via text, whatever, right? Now it's kind of more permissive by removing the word open. The word clear, I feel like, is also doing quite a bit of heavy lifting. Like, where's the line between raising a concern or an outright contradiction? Like clear to whom? Is it the person speaking? Is it the leader interpreting it? So if someone is in clear opposition to the church, is it actually clear? Like, look, in some cases that for sure is, it's, what the definition of is, right? Or what's all those analogies, right? Salt, you can't explain it, but you know it, if you taste it, type of thing, right? You can't explain it to somebody else. So clear opposition to the church, its doctrines, its policies, leaders. It's like, okay, well, that's still rather subjective, right? Can a bishop or stake president just say, this is clear, and boom, bing, bang, boom, done, therefore that satisfies that criteria if it's clear to one person? The word public, right? Clear and deliberate public opposition. Now, here I might say, well, the word public could kind of replace or was redundant with the term open. Maybe open implied public, and therefore they've retained the word public. But public is undefined. Does my podcast count as public? I think most would probably say yes. What if my podcast had 10 listeners? What if it had no listeners? What if it's someone's blog post? Or what if it's a conversation at a dinner party? Right? Like, there's no threshold that's in place for what constitutes being public in your opposition to the church, its doctrine, its policies, and its leaders, which means an audience of any size could qualify. Again, a very permissive approach to saying what satisfies the public criteria. Then there's the word deliberate, clear and deliberate public opposition to the church, right? So that's mixing or conflating intention with disagreement. So someone can sincerely believe that the church would benefit from a different approach. That's not necessarily opposition. That's investment. That's faithful criticism. That's input, and without defining the word deliberate, then every honest critique becomes potentially punishable. So what does it mean to deliberately, publicly oppose, to be deliberate, right? Another term that causes issues. So too with the church. Again, before it was just the rules and regulations. It was clear that it was more about the policies. Now it's church. Left vague. Well, it's the church and other things. Its doctrines, leaders, policies. Does this mean the institutional church? Does it mean the corporate entities? Does it mean Deseret Book? Does it mean, the welfare square? Does it mean, KSL? And various corporate entities it owns? Does it mean that the bureaucracy, and there's heavy bureaucracy in the corporate church? If someone disagrees with what's happening at DI or in the missionary department, or thinks that early morning seminary is a bad policy and kids need to sleep in, are they opposing the church? So again, like, it's conveniently vague what that means to oppose the church. Doctrine just means, teachings, theology. But those have changed a lot. So if and when they change over the decades, right, were the people who questioned them earlier opposing earlier doctrine? Were they ahead of the curve? Were they vindicated? Were they apostate, but now they're not? Right? So even doctrine gets a little murky. Policies, I talked about this in a past musing, very open-ended. I mean, having members clean the bathroom at buildings instead of paying for a professional service is a policy. Setting budgets in wards and giving more to the Relief Society than to the Elders Quorum is a policy. Having our youth program that's abysmal and abandoning the Boy Scouts that I have had tons of problems with and still do, right? That's a policy. Is griping about such things or suggesting alternatives or wishing for something different, et cetera, is that grounds for discipline? Is that apostate? Leaders, right? So again, we're going through the church, its doctrines, its policies. Leaders is a very broad word, particularly to attach a consequence like excommunication to or withdrawal of church membership. And I think part of the challenge in throwing the term leaders into the definition of apostasy is it feels like it conflicts with the law and the principle of common consent that the Lord established in the Doctrine and Covenants. So if someone votes no on a leader, are they now at risk? If they have knowledge of someone's corruption or infidelity or whatever, and they vote no, and they are deliberately and publicly, because now you're in the middle of sacrament meeting, right? And saying no. If you're in general conference and you shout no because they're trying to sustain the 70 that had, whatever problem and is not worthy. Now, is that a clear and deliberate public opposition to the leaders of the church? So leaders is pretty broad. One might also argue that leaders of the church themselves fail at this own standard. Church leaders have regularly disagreed with one another on the direction of the church. We've seen this in limited cases when past meeting minutes or videos or transcripts have been leaked, or historians have used them as a basis to say, here's the behind the scenes kind of intrigue that happened that led to, Harold B. Lee pushing for church correlation and trying to steamroll the other apostles who were pushing against him. When a new church president takes a lead, the predecessor's policies and sometimes doctrines get reversed occasionally without much fanfare or courtesy. I mean, the whole I'm the Mormon campaign, everything championed by President Hinckley, all the media put out and all the millions of dollars spent and all the branding, later labeled a victory for Satan by Nelson, who had bristled against it for decades. By the church's own definition, that looks a lot like clear, deliberate public opposition to a prior leader's policy. These definitions cause issues, and being as vague as they are, it's like a law. Like think of with my Libertas Institute think tank hat on. When there's a law written that creates a crime, and that law is very vague, you're empowering the prosecutors. Now you're entirely relying upon the discretion of the prosecutor, and the discretion later, potentially, of the judge. You give the power to them rather than having a very clear policy, very clear law. I know that I am a criminal when I do X. But if you're making it broad and the law is just kind of open-ended and insufficiently clear, and this happens very frequently, now you're just relying upon the good graces of a prosecutor, whether he likes you or dislikes you. If you're, black and in southern United States, and now the prosecutor has all the power and he's going to throw the book at you, but someone else who commits the same crime that looks like you and talks like you is let off the hook. Like, this is how you get corruption in institutions, is by having vague rules that allow for selective prosecution depending on status, relationship, connection, fame, whatever, any number of criteria. So I think clarity is far better than having vague terms to which of which church leaders themselves, according to these definitions, might be guilty in the past. Like, no one thinks that the apostles are apostate because they disagree with one another or disagree with past or overturned policies, So it's like, what are these definitions actually doing? What about that new one, weakening the faith and activity of church members? There's no actual evidence of harm that's required here. Weakening the faith and activity of church members. So if a member says, I didn't weaken anyone's faith, and the bishop says, yeah, you did, the member could ask, well, point me to an example, and the bishop could point to a Facebook post and says, well, that could weaken faith. This is what you see in the UK right now against free speech and people posting memes and oh, that's insulting to Muslims, or that's insulting to immigrants, or that's, insulting to gay people. And there doesn't have to actually be a victim. There doesn't have to even be a complainant. It could be the government on its own going in and saying, we don't like that meme that you posted. And this is horrible. There's all kinds of tyranny happening in the UK right now around this. Right? That's the problem when there's a quote unquote victimless crime and when you're impeding on free speech. And so to say that you are an apostate if you weaken the faith and activity of church members, again, without evidence of harm, you're empowering the prosecutor, in this case, the bishop, the stake president, to get this leadership roulette. You get some hardliner leader, and they have this very vague provision that they can rely upon and be like, I think, Connor, your podcast, and I've been accused of this. There are people in the comments over the years that make this argument about me. They claim that I am weakening the faith and activity of church members. They can't really point to anything. Sometimes, in rare occasions, I've had someone say, oh, my brother-in-law said he listens to your podcast and now he left the church, as if correlation equals causation or, whatever. And to which I generally reply, I'm literally I'm not been good at this recently, but in the past, I would screenshot comments from people and DMs and texts and emails that I get from people saying the opposite. That, Connor, you've strengthened my faith. You've given me a path to see that even if I have challenges and problems and observations and concerns, there is a path to remain faithful. There's a path to cling to the gospel, to have a strong testimony, despite mortal fallibility, despite corporate whatever, despite all the things, historical, et cetera, I can remain faithful. I can cling to the gospel. I can believe in God. I can believe in the restoration. I know the Book of Mormon is true. Connor, you've done that for me, et cetera, right? Just so I've had these posts. So it's like, okay, well, someone can allege that, oh, that one Sunday musing you did weakens faith and activity of church members, right? You're complaining about the youth program. So you're weakening the faith in our leaders who instituted the youth program, and you're weakening the activity of the youth because you're telling them that the program stinks and it's not worth going to weekly activities to just play games all the time. Maybe there's better uses of your time. Connor, you're weakening the faith and activity, right? So the argument could go. And with this vague provision that doesn't require a victim, doesn't require actual evidence of harm, and doesn't even require a balancing test, like, oh, hey, Connor said that, and it quote unquote weakened the faith or activity of these proverbial people, these alleged fictional people. But then also Connor has exact concrete examples of people who are saying the opposite. Is there even a balancing test with this provision? Like, Bob, Mr. Podcaster or author or random person out there, if Bob is alleged to have weakened the faith and activity of church members, is there any analysis done, number one, to substantiate that claim, and number two, to balance it against maybe some good that he did? That's not at all evident in the definition of apostasy. If the bishop believes, or a stake president, that your actions could weaken or do weaken the faith and activity of church members, you are now an apostate. Even if no one's faith was actually weakened, you can be found guilty even if your words or actions strengthen someone else's faith and activity, as is the case with me. So this standard isn't about outcomes. It's about a church leader's subjective reading of your intent or potential impact. This is very problematic language. So when every term, when all these provisions in the definition of apostasy are broad, when they're undefined, when they're subjective, one has to conclude that this is not an accident or an oversight. As I've said, with the way the law is written, it favors the government. It empowers the executive branch. It empowers them to be the determiners of someone's guilt. Ayn Rand has this great quote that I didn't come prepared with, but it's in Atlas Shrugged, and she says something like, "What from the government's perspective, someone in the government is like, what do you think? We want people to be Boy Scouts? We want them to be criminals. We want there to be so many laws, so confusing, so difficult to comply with, so that we can crack down on anyone at any time." And I'm not saying that's the intent behind the leaders of the church, is to be like that, but that is the potential effect when you have all of this vague language, which protects the institution. It empowers the institution's leaders, whereas precise language protects the accused. Having clear laws in our system of government helps everyone clearly know how to color between the lines. Am I violating the law or am I not? There's a great book by Harvey Silverglate called 3 Felonies a Day, where he talks about how at a federal level, there's so many laws, so vague, so broad, so ridiculous, that the average person commits 3 felonies a day. That's his analysis. That is the problem. We all become criminals. Precise language protects the innocent individual, protects the accused, but vague language empowers the institution and protects it. And so we move away from a system of fairness and justice to one about preserving institutional authority to remove anyone at any time for virtually any reason. It's the whole ham sandwich thing you probably heard about prosecutors. Prosecutors like, I can prosecute a ham sandwich. Basically, there's so many laws, there's so many vague laws that we can find a way to go after someone we don't like. And again, I'm not ascribing malicious intent to church leaders. I'm just saying that is the effect of this type of language. It does allow for those outcomes to happen. And I will leave it to you to decide if that has happened in any past such cases of excommunication, or if the likelihood is there for it to happen in the future. All I know is I favor precise language. I think we need more clarity. And the other problem that I have with all of this, I've shared a little bit of this before, is that, and this gets to the heading of my musing, the definition of apostasy is kind of apostate itself. If we go to our trusted 1828 Webster Dictionary to understand what early church leaders meant, and this definition carried for many, many, many decades, apostasy is, and I quote, an abandonment of what one has professed, a total desertion or departure from one's faith or religion. End quote. Okay. An abandonment of what you've professed. Total desertion, total departure. Our own guide to the scriptures from the church says that apostasy is a turning away from the truth. The Topics and Questions little pamphlet or manual says that apostasy is when individuals or groups of people turn away from the principles of the gospel. It says that then they are in the state of apostasy. These are reasonable, common, Webster appropriate definitions or explanations. An abandonment of what you professed, a turning away, a total desertion from the truth, a departure, as Webster says, from the principles of the gospel. Those are all harmonious. Those all make sense. Someone who's abandoned their faith, they have turned away from the principles of the gospel. But I think that's why the handbook definition of apostasy is maybe itself apostate. It has abandoned what was once professed. It has totally deserted its common definition for a far different one. Right? Criticizing a policy, even expressing opposition to a leader, like that is consistent with common consent. That is required for common consent to exist. It is not apostasy. Right? Speaking openly the truth will sometimes weaken the faith and activity of church members. If those church members are tares instead of wheat, if you're teaching some meat and some problematic history or something that is unflattering to past church leaders, there might be a milk drinking church member who struggles with that, and you've now weakened their faith a little bit, not because anything you said was wrong, but just because you said it. Because you shared the truth of history. You're not turning away from the truth. You're not depart from the truth. You've embraced and advocated the truth, which is kind of unflattering or inconsistent with their perception or their very simple faith. And now they stop coming to church, and now you've weakened their activity. Look, you weaken their activity because you told them X, Y, or Z thing, right? This is the problem. We've encumbered the reason, like, look, if someone totally starts attacking core theological definitions and beliefs of the church, if they've totally, abandoned that, then I'm not saying no one's, clearly there's apostasy. It's been happening since Joseph's day. It happens today. It's people who are abandoning, I no longer believe these things. I think the church is, a farce, et cetera, et cetera. It's people who are just like, I'm done. It is not people who believe in the core principles and theological claims of the gospel of Jesus Christ, but just who take issue with, I don't know, Nelson and First Presidency telling everyone to get the clot shot, right? Or saying that it's a victory for Satan for the Mormon stuff or whatever, right? Or having your I don't like the come follow me thing, or I wish we had home teaching, or like whatever it is, right? There is a way to faithfully, lovingly express difference of opinion. The Quorum of the 12 does it all the time. These guys are not just like no humans are, right? But they find a way to deliberate and share that. And maybe it's that it's like all behind closed doors, and that's what people really want, is they want to project an image of unanimity. And it's just the fact that here's a guy with a podcast kind of opening a little bit of the dirty laundry. But we're human. We all have dirty laundry. It's okay. I think sunlight is the best disinfectant. I don't think we're all going to have great harmony and great outcomes if everything is hidden and swept under the rug. And if disagreements and observations and critiques are only privately worked up the channel and then, buried along the way. I think there's room for faithful critique. I think there's room to be deeply committed to the gospel, but still share truths and ideas and thoughts that might be perceived as weakening faith or activity when that's not the intent and there's no actual harm. And oh, by the way, the things being shared are strengthening the faith of a whole bunch of other people, right? And if I feel right now like I'm seeming a little defensive, like I'm not worried. They're like 3 questions that I frequently get. The first is, how do you sleep? That is the most common question that I get in all contexts from all kinds of people. Like, or when do you sleep, rather? When do you sleep? And the second I get, and this is just from kind of LDS friends and followers, is, have you been pulled into the bishop's office yet? You know, are they coming after you for your membership? Because the perception is, I'm not allowed to be doing this stuff. How dare I be open with my thoughts and publicly share observations that are not totally in line and lockstep and so forth. And I'll just tell you, as of the date of this recording, no, I haven't been. And I hope I never will be. And maybe I'm benefiting from leadership roulette. And if I had a hardline bishop who had all this vague language to use, I could easily be excommunicated for apostasy right now, despite going to church every week, paying my tithing, doing service, doing like deeply believing the gospel, teaching it to my children, you know, like being someone who is passionate about the gospel of Jesus Christ. You know, I back to the first question, like, you know, when do you sleep? It's like, I spend a lot of time doing these, and I enjoy the research, and I enjoy pondering and trying to think through these questions and trying to figure out how do we purge ourselves, as I've said in past musing, how do we purge ourselves of the idolatry and the wickedness, the traditions of our fathers, the slow stain of the world. That is what I think is so important in our day. That is what has befallen every past society. I don't want to be guilty of that. I don't want to fall into that trap. And so I feel called through this vehicle to bring that to the surface, to foster conversation. Am I perfect at it? No. Am I strengthening 100% of the people viewing? No. I don't know where you're at. I don't know where person X, Y, or Z is at in their faith journey. I don't know if you've never heard this before, if you've heard it 18 times. I don't know if, you know, whatever, right? Everyone's on their own. I can't take accountability for anyone but myself and my intent. And I don't think anyone can argue that my intent is to pull people's faith and testimony down. I think any reasonable observer would see that it's quite the opposite. I'm trying to point out problems with the hopes that we can move beyond them and grow in our faith and deepen our testimony and create Zion. And man, that is what gets me fired up. But notwithstanding all of that, looking at the vague definitions of apostasy, I could be today, despite all of that, excommunicated if I had the wrong leader or someone with a bone to pick or an area authority who's putting pressure on my stake president, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is the problem with this type of language. Because I'm not an apostate. I've not turned away from my beliefs, right? If we go back to those definitions, I've not abandoned my faith. I've not deserted the gospel. I've not departed from quite the opposite, man. It's what I think about. It's what I focus on. It's what I share. It's what So if someone like me, if the critics out there, some of whom I'm sure will be in the comments, want to allege that someone like me could be guilty, and I am, the plain reading of that language is broad enough that someone could make that accusation and I could be, you know, kicked out. Like, that's just not okay. And that's a problem. Precise language protects the innocent. Precise language gives confidence to people that the institution, the government, the church is focused on actual problems and not using vague language to, you know, ferry out people it doesn't like for whatever reason or protect image or whatever. So anyways, we're going to end there. I thought that was interesting. Doing a little historical deep dive, I found some interesting nuggets. There were some other nuggets that I found that have nothing to do with apostasy in the early, like 1940 church manual that I got a chuckle about. So you can find these yourself, church history catalog, search, you know, church handbook, and you'll be able to find them. But I thought that was very interesting how fluid the definition of apostasy is. It's kind of like making covenants. If the covenants change, the temple and like if you're constantly changing everything, it's like, well, wait a minute, like then is the covenant I made still valid, or how does that change? Or my wife covenanted this way, but my daughter's going to covenant different. Like, huh? You know, and what, like, it surfaces these important questions for us to consider. And if the definition itself of apostasy has so drastically changed over time, including that ping pong of, you know, it's like, shouldn't apostasy be more like consistent and common sense that doesn't vary all the time? So tell me what you think in the comments. Let me know, what did I miss? Should I go back before 1940? You find this interesting? Do you like more of these historical deep dives or more just kind of top level commentary stuff and reaction to what's going on? Always eager to get your input. See you in the comments. Appreciate the discussion, and I'll see you next week.